Welcome to the UN Brief. I'm your host, Maya Plants. Today we interview Peter Prengaman, Western U.S. News Director at the Associated Press. Peter was posted in Brazil during the impeachment process of Dilma Rousseff. He's writing a book on her impeachment. And we also spoke about his coverage of the wildfires in Western U.S., as well as the DART Award for trauma reporting that he received for that coverage on COVID-19 nurses and those who lost their loved ones. Thank you very much for watching the UN Brief. Don't forget to subscribe. You were bureau chief in Rio for a couple of years for AP, Associated Press.
That's right. I was there for, I was the bureau chief for 3 years in Brazil. Covered everything from the Olympics in 2016 to the ouster of Dilma Rousseff.
So you were posted in several other countries. You were in Spain, you were in Morocco. Where else? What countries have you served the Associated Press? Because it has been always with the AP as well, too.
I've been in lots of different places. For the AP, early in my career, I was based in the Caribbean, the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And then before Brazil, I was based in Argentina. I was the news editor in the Southern Cone. And then I was in Brazil. And then previously, sort of in other lives, I worked as a freelancer in Morocco and then went back as on a sabbatical and studied advanced Arabic intensively. And yeah, I've lived and worked as a journalist also in Spain, some in Chile as a freelancer, and just a lot of kind of floating around, especially early in my career. And I'm now based in Phoenix, Arizona, and this is my 8th physical location for the AP. It's been a great run, and lots of moving around, lots of different assignments, lots of just really interesting stuff.
You've been in charge also of cross-platform reportage. You even won an award last year, right? Because you covered the COVID-19 using photographs and you know the series that you developed also about people who have lost their loved ones. Tell us a bit about that process of developing the series.
So I and a co-editor worked on this project that we called Lives Lost. And the idea was to look at the lives of ordinary people and write them as if they were obits of famous people. I mean, because everybody has interesting things in their lives, right? And everybody is important to somebody. And so we just thought that would be a way to memorialize a little bit in a larger way, just kind of how many people have died, like basically tell the big story through small little stories. And we worked with this co-editor and I, Raghu Vadarevo. We worked with people all around the world, and the photos and the audio pieces of it were really interesting because especially early in the pandemic, we didn't want to be sending people out more than we had to interview people, especially interview loved ones who had lost people because maybe they had COVID, and that would put more people at risk. And so Raghu had the idea. He said, well, what if we had them do audio remembrances? And so we asked family to do that, to just do 2 minutes of audio of what they remember about their family member. Some were really into it, some didn't want to do it, it was too painful. But we were able to join that with photos, like family photos in many cases, of their loved one. And it just made for, I think, really powerful storytelling.
Reading through some of the stories, and indeed, the way they relate, the way you get so close to their pain, at the same time, it's not exploitative. It's really like, bringing home, the devastation for so many of us, right? Who have lost the loved ones, and how I loved how they spoke about their objects that would remind them of that person, right? Like someone leaves the shoes of their daughter of her daughter near the doorway. Some way she thinks that's a good way to remember the daughter, that maybe she comes back, or at least in her imagination. And you also reported on instances of modern day slavery. I don't know if that was when you were in Brazil already, was or was before. There were some really, really interesting stories that actually, you discussed also with the judges, and they were sort of not paying attention too much. But there were people from a church to the US on a tourist visa and then forced to work for free, for no pay. Oh, and they had their passports confiscated. Can you tell us a bit about that story too?
An investigative series that I worked on with two colleagues, Bert Moore and Mitch Weiss in the U.S., and I was in Brazil. And the story is basically what you said. I mean, there was a church in North Carolina that made outreach and developed relationships in Brazil, started this same church, and then was having people come to the U.S. on tourist visas, and basically putting them to work. And for some, I think it was probably like, okay, they wanted to do the work of the church, but it was also exploitative, and that came out a lot. And through this investigation, authorities started taking a much closer look at what this church was doing, and cracking down on some of these practices. And the church still exists. It's still in Brazil, still in North Carolina, but as I think a smaller entity.
Yes, you won the DART Award for trauma reporting for your series on the families grieving. But there was also a very beautiful story where you used multiple exposure photographs to tell the story of the nurses, of their, trauma, really, of having to take care of all these sick people, some of them who never recovered, who died, and they had to be there. They could not be present. So tell us a bit, how did that story came about, and how did you work out with the nurses and the photographer to develop the concept and the story?
Yeah, it was a really exciting thing. Photographer in Los Angeles, Jay Hong, who is just super creative and is always kind of pushing the limits of storytelling, had this idea to shoot nurses, make pictures of them in a special way, of them in the COVID ward, but first take a picture, just a portrait, and then take multiple exposures of that background, and then combine those things. And I mean, this was a concept that he came up with. This was really his story. But I was so kind of intrigued by what he was trying to do, that I raised my hand to do this story. I mean, as a regional editor, I don't do many original stories these days. I work with other people's stories, right? And that's my job, and I love it. But every now and then I do like to do a story still. And this one, I was just so taken with this photographer's vision. And so I interviewed all the nurses and wrote the story. And the idea, I mean, his idea and what we tried to develop was that if you go through trauma, if you're a nurse and you've worked in this COVID ward for a year and you've seen all these things, even if things are better now, like you don't completely divorce yourself from the past, right? And I think that's the reality for all of us, whether you work in trauma or not. If you go through something terrible, like the past is still with you somehow. Like you and I are sitting here in the present, but things of our past are still with us. And I think we're going to see that more and more in the years ahead in all ways of COVID, because it's been such a hard experience, for the world, really.
So, but you also cover wildfires, climate change, the drought in the West. So tell us a bit, what are the stories now? Because again, you are in the season, right? And it affects California is particularly impacted, but I imagine also where you are now, Arizona as well, right? What is the situation now there in terms of covering all these stories?
Yeah, so my team is, across the West, focused on wildfires is a really big one, and that's a big one every year. And this year particularly, we're also focused on drought because, droughts come and go in the West or around the world, but the last few years have been particularly bad in the West. And what we're trying to capture more than anything is how daily life is changing, because all of what's happening, or parts of it are connected to climate change. I mean, scientists say this kind of over and over, or things that would happen normally or do happen normally are exacerbated. So then the next question is, well, how do we measure that? And that's what we're trying to do, with our drought coverage. How is daily life changing? We recently did a story out of Lake Powell in Utah, for example, where boating and a lot of the regular summer activities are no longer, available. We did a couple of really nice packages out of Southern Oregon in what's called the Klamath Basin, this massive area where many people no longer have water. Like, it's not just water shortages. There's no water. You turn on your spigot, there's no water coming. The wells are dry. People are having to move. So that's a big one. We did another really nice piece on the Great Salt Lake, which is also very dry, and its levels are really low. So, each time that's what we try to measure. Or another one that's actually really interesting last week was on horses. Like, the government has started rounding up wild horses in different parts of the West. And that's in part because the horses drink the water that society needs. And so there's a feeling, and this is very controversial, but that these horses need to be removed, so that they're not competing with farmers who need the water for their crops with people in cities. So that's our big question, is how is life changing? And if you can answer that, then I think you can come to compelling stories about drought.
United Nations marks this week as the World Water Week, right, where they try to mobilize awareness around these issues. And as you mentioned, like just now, the stories are surfacing, right, that we're looking, suddenly you tell me a city doesn't have water. So what are the issues there? Like, how are the cities are going to address, or governments, state governments will address these issues, right? How do they make sure that, there's, because there is some new technology you can use to actually improve the efficiency of water usage, but how fast are we going to be able to do that is the challenge, right?
Right. One way off the top is just putting limits on water use, doing that through encouraging people, or raising the costs of water, or just mandating straight out, water can't be used from these hours. So they do it that way. There are also lots of legal fights. The Colorado River, as you may know, gives water to about 40 million people in the US and it winds through all these states. And the compacts of the river go back more than 100 years. They're very complicated, but there's a pecking order of, who gets the water first, and, what states and what kind of people. And so what you find is increasingly like legal fights over water as well. We take it for granted sometimes, but water is one of the most vital things in the world, right? I mean, you need clean water to drink, to bathe, to everything. So not having it is a real problem.
You are also writing a book on the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, the ousted president of Brazil. Can you tell us a bit about the book, how it came about, the idea? Because you were there, right? You witnessed the process. You arrived just during or before, just before.
So I'm writing this with a friend and colleague, Mauricio Savarese. The two of us covered the impeachment process of Dilma Rousseff. I was the bureau chief. He was, a lead reporter on the story. And I think we were both just taken by how somebody was thrown out of office on grounds that arguably were pretty flimsy. I mean, she was accused of moving the budget around in ways that accusers said, was hiding shortfalls, and she was doing this to shore up support was the accusation. But, what she did was something that previous presidents have done, though not to the extent that she did. And there was just this large feeling that we had, having covered impeachment, that people didn't really understand it that much. It was like, oh, this person's getting impeached for like fiscal irregularities. What is that? And even today, if you were to ask Brazilians, like, why did Rousseff get impeached? You'll hear all kinds of explanations. She was a bad president. They didn't want to have a woman president anymore. She was the first woman president in Brazil. There are all kinds of theories, but what you don't hear much is what she was actually accused of, and whether those things were grounds for being ousted from office. So we were really taken with this and wanted to explore it. So the book that we're working on is an exploration of impeachment, this year of impeachment, and to a larger extent, kind of a look at democracy and the fragility of democracy, right? Like, Dilma Rousseff was voted president twice, and she was pushed out on, like I said, arguably pretty flimsy grounds. And there was so much to this story too. I mean, was she managing the country very well? Probably not. Was she, she was not a very good politician. She just, by her own estimation, wasn't very good at kind of the backslapping old boy network of Brasilia. And there are lots of other factors that went into this, but it makes for, I think, a really interesting look at democracy and how things can change.
Yeah, she was much more of a bureaucrat, actually. She rose through the ranks of PT, the Workers' Party, by serving in different positions in government, right? In the state government of Rio Grande do Sul first, and then she was propped up by Lula because somewhat they thought she was the good one, right? But I think there was a lot of jealousy too, it seems, right? There were other people who would like to have been, appointed successors to Lula's. So there's a lot of to be looked into. I'm sure you're going to have really, lots of material, within Brazilian politics themselves. And as you said, this flimsy excuse to remove a president, even if she wasn't maybe corresponding to expectations of, how to run the country. As you said, apparently this was, other presidents have done some similar sort of fiscal engineering, which is not really right, but at the same time, not grounds for impeachment. So when is the book going to come out? Do you have it planned? Have you started? How far along are you? Or
no, the final edits, and our hope is that it will be out, very soon, because we're at, this month is 5 years since Rousseff was removed. It was a 9-month process. We're at the 5-year mark. So no, it hopefully will be out very soon. We're publishing it through AP Books. AP has a book wing, and it's been just a great process to write it, to go through the edits, to just kind of all we've learned along the way. It's a fascinating story. I think Dilma Rousseff is a fascinating person. Like you said, like, she had all these positions in government, but her first job of elected office was president. Which is something to think about as well. Like, and I think that in some ways hurt her because she didn't have the training of lower level political jobs, right? I mean, she had all these appointments. That's one kind of a political job. Another is like elected official. And she didn't have that. She was basically elected because Lula, who was super popular when he left, said, this is my successor. So yeah, just so many things came together. And one thing that we argue in the book too is that the ouster of Rousseff was in large part what opened the door to Jair Bolsonaro, right? Because the left collapsed, the traditional right wasn't really, they were very engulfed in this big corruption scandal called, Lava Jato or car wash. And so in the pushing out of Rousseff and pushing out of the Workers' Party, it created an opening for Jair Bolsonaro and the hard right. And so I think that's the tie for today. Like, if you look at Brazil and you say, how did we get to this point, with this particular president, with this situation, this political situation? Now people are talking about impeaching him. How did we get to this point? I think you have to really look back to the impeachment of 2016.
Thank you so much, Peter. Pleasure speaking with you. So looking forward to the book. Let me know when it's about to be published so we can again talk about it or